Hello. Today we're going to venture into a slightly different realm of history. In fact, this is closer to perhaps philosophy than to history itself. And I'm going to take the opportunity to introduce you to what I immodestly call Brands's Laws of History. Now you'll see I don't take this too seriously, and you shouldn't take it too seriously either. But the reason I call them Brands's Laws of History is that I wouldn't want you to get the mistaken impression that these are laws of history that anybody else necessarily buys into. These are my laws of history. More precisely, they're my observations on human behavior in time, my observations of history. And as you'll see from the first law, which I'm going to introduce you to right now, you'll see that it's sort of half tongue-in-cheek, but there are lessons, I think, and morals here. So, anyway, the first of Brands's laws of history is this: there are no laws of history. So, that seems to negate the whole enterprise. So, Brands's first law of history is that there are no laws of history. But, and there's a big but here, but there are patterns. And that's what I want to investigate. And the reason I want to do this is that in this course, we're looking at a large sweep of history. Why are we looking at this large sweep of history? Well, because I'm interested in history, and I hope that many of you are interested in history, but I also understand that a lot of you are taking this class because you have to take the class. It's a requirement at the University of Texas to graduate. If you want to get out of UT with an undergraduate degree, you have to take 2 semesters of American history, and for most of you, this is going to be one of those semesters. So that raises the question of why? Why are you required to take 2 semesters of U.S. history? And the answer is that at one point, and we presume continuing, the state legislature decided that it would be a good idea for students at public universities to learn something about the history of the country that they live in. This because we are a democracy, and you are now, or you will be, citizens of this republic. Most of you are able to vote now, and I hope you'll be voting in the election, the various elections this fall. And so the legislature believed, and I fully agree with them. I don't agree with everything the legislature in Texas does, but I agree with this, that responsible citizens need to know something about the country they live in and the political system that they're a part of. So it's almost like taking a driver's education class in order to qualify for a license. Now, in fact, nobody requires this to vote. You get to vote even if you haven't taken this class, but you'll be a better citizen. So but what's behind this? I mean, some of it has to do with just sort of knowing what came before. But there's often a desire, a belief, that if we know more about history, then we'll know more about where the world is going, as though there's a kind of direction to history. And not everybody would go so far as to say that there are laws of history that dictate what's going to happen in the future. In fact, historians have pursued this for a long time to no conspicuous success. But the idea still is if we know where we've been, we'll have a better chance of knowing where we're going, or maybe guiding where we're going. So this is, well, I'm going to say a little bit more about why I think there are no laws of history, but why I do think there are patterns. And I'll get to the patterns, but I'm just pointing out that all sorts of people look to history for guidance as to what comes next. I'm a historian, and I get calls and emails from reporters and various other people at particular moments, including the present. So what does this current pandemic predict for the future? Or what of the changes that we're experiencing now are going to be permanent? And my first answer to all of this is I'm simply a historian. I'm not a future teller. I have a hard enough time trying to explain the past. Don't ask me to predict the future. That's what I say first, but they say, well, come on, you have some perspective on this, so I'll give them my best shot. But I do say that historians really aren't that much better, at least if you look at their track record, in predicting the future. It's hard enough for us to explain the past. But having said all that, I'm going to talk a little bit about these patterns. And I'm going to, first of all, raise the question. And I pose the question to you. I pose it to anybody who observes human life, human behavior, human history. to ask you if you think I assert that there are patterns in history. And I'm going to take the pattern idea and move it in a slightly different direction. So I'll pose the question this way. Do events in history have a direction? Is there some kind of, can you say that things are moving in a direction? Are we moving toward a more generous society, a more liberal society? Conversely, you might think we're moving to a more terrible society, that people are becoming more selfish. We're moving towards something. There is a desire to discern whether we are, in fact, moving toward something or not. And when we say moving towards something, this implies that there is a direction. I've used the term direction to history, but it might be simply a direction to sort of human events. Okay, keep that question in mind. And I am going to point out that nearly every human society, we're studying American history, but if we were studying the history of any society, nearly every society has what you could call an origin story. How did our society, how did our people, how did we, because the we referring to whatever group this is, how did we come into existence? How did we get to where we are today? Now, if you think about it, how did we get to where we are today? This is exactly an answer to the question, or at least it raises the question in an obvious way, is there a direction to history? And nearly every society basically answers the question, yes, there is. More on this in a moment, too. But if you think about the various kinds of origin stories, if you look at ancient civilizations including the ancient Hebrews, the Israelites, their version of the origin story was that, it's the version that's told in the Bible's book of Genesis, that in the beginning, God made the heavens and the earth. And so it's pretty common, and it has been pretty common for millennia, for these origin stories to invoke some kind of supernatural being who makes the first humans. Now, the first humans are usually members of whatever society is telling the story. So various Native American tribes in America had their origin stories. Peoples in Africa, peoples in Asia, you name it. They all have their origin stories. The Romans, they had the story of Romulus and Remus, these two orphan infants who were adopted by a wolf. And often the origin stories are pretty strange if you don't sort of buy into them. If you do buy into them, that's the way it works. So, God created Adam out of a lump of clay, and then made Eve, pulled a rib from Adam and made Eve. And so, all right, to some extent, these stories they get normalized the more often they're repeated. So they can be, as I say, they're strange to other people. They might seem unusual to the group telling them in the first place, but once you get used to it, you get used to it. But anyway, so it makes perfect sense for humans to ask this question, where are we from? And as I say, for millennia, the answer had something to do with the religion of the society. And so there was this God, this supernatural being, this unusual set of circumstances that gave rise to us. And so we need to adore this person, we need to offer sacrifices to this supernatural being, whatever it is. But it does a couple of things. One is it explains, at least it purports to explain, where we came from, because everybody knows that adults come from children who come from babies, who come from the sex of their parents, the parents have sex and so on. But if you go back far enough, how far back do you go? Where did this all begin? Presumably, it had a beginning. And the origin stories get to this question of the beginning. The hold of the supernatural as involving these, as explaining the origins of things, it got weakened a little bit as a result of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolutions of the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. And probably the most serious blow to these supernatural origin stories, whether biblical or other kind of revelatory origin stories, was Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. Because, as Darwin explains it, humans come into existence as the evolved descendants of our primate ancestors, and the primates came from something else, came from something else, came from something else. So there is sort of less of the need for God, if we want to call this supernatural being God, to reach down and all of a sudden, create humans. And Darwin has a different explanation. Now, it doesn't exactly sort of resolve the issue entirely, because Darwin didn't explain where the first form of life came from. If you buy the Darwin, if once Darwin proposes this, when people began to say, all right, this is fine, it still left the question of, well, if we know where humans came from, how do we know where their forebears came from, or the forebears of them, and the forebears of them, and so on? How far back does this go? Presumably, there's a moment when life on Earth begins. So maybe that's the thing that has to be explained. Those are the biologists. Then there are the physicists who take things even farther back. The physicists will go back now to the beginnings of the universe. And the universe began with this Big Bang many billions of years ago. And boom, there was nothing before this, and it comes into existence. And then you just sort of trace out over the subsequent 14 billion years or so how we got to where we are today. Now, that's a different kind of origin story, and if you want the mechanical version, the sort of the physical science version, it can be satisfying. But it still leaves aside the question of, all right, well, what was there before the Big Bang? Now, some of the scientists say, well, there's nothing before the Big Bang because the Big Bang is when it all begins. But a lot of people find that unsatisfying because, okay, if there's time after the Big Bang, there must have been time before the Big Bang. And this is something that physicists still debate. But needless to say, this doesn't get us, once you start talking about the Big Bang, then you're not in the realm of history anymore. But wait a minute, actually you are, because the Big Bang and the theory about it is simply the history of the universe. And at some point fairly late in the day, sometimes all of the history of the universe is likened to a single day. Sometime after 11:30 in the evening, humans come along. Very close to midnight, humans come along. And so we're just sort of where this has been going. Which gets us back to this question of, is there a direction to history? And the answer that every historian gives, at least implicitly, is, yeah, there's a direction to history, and it leads from wherever you start. In the case of our course, as I mentioned earlier, on the books, our course starts in 1492, but we started around 20,000 years ago, when the first humans arrived in North America. So we start then, and where do we go? Well, in this course, we go to 1865. So the title of the course is 1492 to 1865. There's a built-in sort of direction there. We go from pre-colonial times to 1865. And if you take the second half of the course, it goes from 1865 to the present. Implicitly in all the study of history, things are leading up to the present. And so the goal of these history theorists is that if we can figure out what got humans, or whatever group we're studying, from that starting point up to here, well then, by sheer momentum, if nothing else, we can project into the future. So if we know what caused this, what caused this, what caused this, and got us to here, then presumably some of the same causes are going to go on into the future. So this has been the goal of those people who want to look into the past and see in it a crystal ball which will allow us to divine the future. Now, I have to say that historians have not been very good at predicting what's going to happen. Well, I take it back. It sort of depends on the scale or the degree or the kind of history you're interested in. Because, for example, if you ask a historian today, even a historian of finance, a historian of the American stock market, okay, where is the Dow Jones average, the principal bellwether of the American stock market, where is it going to be a year from now? Presumably, that historian of finance could look back over the last 100 years or more that the Dow Jones average has been in existence, and look at the graphs and all this and say, okay, we'll just extrapolate into the future, and there you go. Now, of course, if the historians could do that, if the historians of finance could do that, if we historians could do it, we'd all be rich. Because if you know what the Dow Jones average is going to be a year from now, then you can make your investments, you can make your speculative bets accordingly. And in fact, if somebody had asked this question 3 months ago, 4 months ago, before the pandemic crisis hit, it was clear that the Dow Jones was on a tear. It had been going up and up and up since the financial crisis of 2008. And it had almost reached 30,000, and one could easily say it's going to go to 40,000. But then, boom! This big surprise comes along, and the Dow Jones loses a third of its value. It goes from almost 30,000 down to 20,000. And this is one that blindsided nearly everybody, the historians included. Now, historians and epidemiologists had allowed for the possibility that this sort of thing happens, but nobody knew when it was going to happen. And so this gets to the part of when I said, you can kind of predict a little bit if, depending on sort of the degree, the detail you're looking for. So I can't tell you what the Dow Jones average is going to be a year from now. So I say, if I could, I'd be rich. But I can't, so I won't. I'm not even going to try. But I can predict certain things with a fair amount of confidence regarding, well, okay, so the population of the United States has been growing pretty steadily for the last 200 years. I mean, more than that if you go back into colonial times. And there's every reason to believe that the population of the United States is going to continue to grow. Now, there's an outside chance that something, a pandemic, much more serious than the one we have now, than the coronavirus pandemic, one like the plague, the Black Death of the 14th century, that killed a third of the population of Europe. It's not impossible that something like that could happen. So maybe the growth rate of the United States, maybe it's going to reverse. Maybe the United States will have a smaller population 50 years from now. I can't rule that out. But what I can say is that with certain degrees of confidence, that's not likely to happen. Using history to predict the future is a little bit like forecasting the weather. So if you look on the weather report this morning, weather forecast for tomorrow, it might say 70% chance of rain. What does that mean? Well, basically it means that on the basis of the past, in 70% of the cases where the conditions looked like they look today, and as they're appearing likely to look over the next, let's say, 24 hours, in 70% of those cases, it rained. And, that's not an ironclad guarantee. If you were a gambling person, you might say, all right, 70% of those are pretty good odds. I'll bet on the fact that it's going to rain. And maybe if you're planning an outdoor event and you have a possibility of getting a tent to cover it up to ward off the rain, 70% chance of rain tomorrow, maybe you get that tent. Now, there's a possibility that it's going to be sunny and you will have wasted the money you spent on the tent, but still, so there it is. Anyway, as the physicists primarily, and the cosmologists, the people who developed sort of theories of the universe, people like Isaac Newton, who came up with this law of universal gravitation, who got really good at predicting, for example, when there would be eclipses of the sun and eclipses of the moon and exactly where the planets would be at different times. This is powerful stuff, and it is very predictive. And chemists and people who study things on a much smaller scale, they eventually learned about nuclear fission, and they were able to calculate what the critical mass of a radioactive material was. And the critical mass is the amount, if you get it together, then you start a runaway chain reaction that can be harnessed to make, for example, an atom bomb. And these are really accurate predictions. They've been tested out time and again, and they bear out. So that kind of prediction is, well, it's really sort of envy-provoking in historians and other people who deal in reality. Because, boy, if we knew what critical mass, to borrow that phrase, was required to cause a developing country's economy to start really advancing and raising the standard of living, then we'd have a better chance of knowing sort of which which of the developing countries today in Africa is going to be really wealthy 50 years from now. Or if you knew what kind of critical mass of diplomacy and an arms race is required to give rise to a war, then maybe you could predict the war, and then maybe you could do something about it. Which raises a really fundamental point here as to why, going back to Brands' first law of history, there are no laws of history. Because if you did have the ability to foresee the future, you would be tempted, if you didn't like the way the future was turning out, to try to change the future. And this brings us into a basically different position. So when I say that there are no laws of history, but there are patterns, and one of the things I often say to sort of explain that further is that humans aren't atoms. They're more complicated than that. And so one of the reasons that chemists can talk about chemical reactions with a great deal of confidence is that as far as we can tell, every hydrogen atom is exactly like every other hydrogen atom, and leaving aside isotopes and stuff like that. But basically, these are the properties of the different elements. And so you can predict them. And furthermore, not only are they all alike, in a way that humans aren't all alike, humans are all different. The other thing is that the atoms have no awareness of what's going on, and therefore no ability, or if they could have ability, maybe motivation, to try to change the future. So when you are dealing with human affairs, you find yourself in a situation even more complicated than predicting the weather. Or to use another example, so geologists and seismologists, people who study earthquakes, they look at features of the Earth's crust, like the San Andreas Fault in California. And they look over the long history of the San Andreas Fault, and they say that it's moved hundreds of miles, and they've been able to actually document dozens of major earthquakes along that fault. And there's every reason to think that the forces that gave rise to the earthquakes that caused the fault to slip the way it does continue to work, and therefore there are going to be more earthquakes, presumably including some major earthquakes, along the San Andreas Fault. So if you live along the fault, if you live in the San Francisco Bay Area, for example, you better build pretty strong buildings, or more precisely, flexible buildings that can stand the shaking of an earthquake. So they can predict that, and they can tell you that over the next 150 years, there's a 90% chance of a major earthquake like the one that destroyed San Francisco in 1906. So that sort of thing. But they can't tell you what day it's going to happen on. They can't tell you that it's going to happen tomorrow. Seismologists are getting a little bit better at reading some of the precursors to earthquakes, and this applies in that sort of subcategory of volcanology. When is a volcano going to erupt? So when was Mount St. Helens, the volcano in Washington, going to erupt? The volcanologists, they watched, and the mountain was actually swelling up, and they could infer from that magma was coming up, and so they were pretty sure there was going to be an explosion of some sort. They didn't know exactly when, and that's why a number of people died when the volcano exploded. So there are those kinds of predictions. Again, these fall kind of in the category of forecasting the weather, where you make them on the basis of probability, but neither the weather nor earthquakes nor volcanoes have the capacity to try to outguess you. And so if I make a prediction that, let's say, of two candidates in a political contest, this one's going to win. All right? So we do polls and we make this prediction. Well, there are reactions that the people who are going to go to the polls might actually make from this. They might say, oh good, we're going to win, and therefore I want to be the first one to cast the vote for my favorite candidate. Or they might get overconfident, and they might say, well, if we're going to win, why should I bother to go to the polls? Or, it works the other way around. If we're predicted to lose, then what's the point? But my point in this is that when you look at these things, when you try to predict them, when you're dealing with people, then you have the possibility that they're going to hear the predictions and not liking them, they're going to try to foil the predictions. So this sort of thing happens, and that it adds a layer of complexity. There's there's a last element to this that, and I'm just going to put it to you because I said at the beginning this was going to be as much an exercise in philosophy as it was history, but this is where philosophy and history sort of come into contact most closely. Suppose there was a theory of history. And so suppose I could basically look in my historical crystal ball or my theory book, and I could say, okay, this is what's going to happen over the next 10 years, next 20 years. And let's say I could say, all right, in the year 2036, that's going to be a presidential year, so-and-so is going to get elected president. Okay? So, and let's suppose that something gave me reason to believe, gave you reason to believe, that this was as worthy of your confidence as a prediction about if you mix these two chemicals together, there will be this reaction. If you take 2/3 of a critical mass of uranium, another 2/3 over here, and you smack them together so you get more than the critical mass, there's going to be an explosion. Okay? So if you had that kind of confidence, what would that say about the possibility of human free will? So if the future is already cooked in to the extent where I can see it and I can develop this law of history, well, what does this say about our ability to make choices for ourselves? Now, I ask you, do you believe in free will? Answers to this have varied over human history to the opposite poles. So some people say, of course I have free will. I decided whether to get out of bed this morning or not. I decided what I was going to have for breakfast. To the other ones who say, no, you think you have free will, but you are conditioned. You're conditioned by your childhood. You're conditioned by your material circumstances. You're conditioned by what you studied about history. You think you have free will, but you're wrong. And so if there was this omniscient being, if there is this omniscient being, that omniscient being knew what was going to happen to you from the day you were born, from before you were born. And many religions believe this, and they promote this idea that there is this all-seeing, all-knowing God. And this God knows exactly what we're going to do. And in fact, it has been the theologians, the people who study religion, who have wrestled the most with this question of free will. Because if God knows ahead of time what I'm going to do, then how can I be in control? How can I be responsible? How can I be held responsible for the things that I do? So if you believe in sin, if you believe that sin is this thing that people do wrong, and that if you believe in a religion that says if you sin and you die in sin, you're going to go to hell or have some kind of eternal punishment, well, that seems like a rather rotten deal because, I'm being punished for this thing that I actually had no control over. And this is why theologians have had a real hard time with this. So when you start looking for a theory of history, for history as predicting, then you very quickly run up against this question of, well, can you square the idea of historical prediction with the concept of free will? And then there's the question of, well, if you could, would you want to? So I'll pose the question to you, any individual. Do you want to know what's going to happen to you? And let's suppose that your future is basically wired in, that somewhere in the book of ages it's written down. And would you want to know? So here's a straightforward one. If somebody could tell you how old you're going to be when you die, would you want to know? If most of you are, let's say, 20 years old. So if somebody told you you were going to die at the age of 25, would you want to know that now? Would you want to know that in advance? If, by contrast, you could be told, and you would have confidence in this, that you're going to live to be 95, would you want to know that? So, I'm going to guess, but this is just a guess, that more people would want to know they're going to live to 95 than would want to know they're going to live to 25. 25 is, close enough. But on the other hand, maybe if you know you've only got 5 years left to live, you would behave differently. I mean, who knows? Anyway, so this gets us back to the original question, or my assertion, The assertion that Brands' first law of history, there are no laws of history, but there are patterns. Oh, well, I really haven't gotten much to the patterns. So what are the patterns? Well, the patterns, what I would say, are the way that humans have behaved over time. Not so much as individuals, but in groups. So this is where I'm going to draw a parallel with another branch of physics, and that is quantum mechanics. So the quantum theorists in the early part of the 20th century realized that they were unable to predict exactly what a particular small particle was going to do at a particular time. All they could do, and this had to do with the fact that things are both waves and particles. And if you're going to preserve the wave behavior and the wave properties, then you lose some of the particle properties and vice versa. So you can only know so much, and this gets into the Heisenberg's so-called uncertainty principle. But the point here is that if you want to make predictions about single things and single moments, there's only so close you can get. But if you're willing to deal in statistical probabilities, if you're going to ask yourself, so where are a whole bunch of molecules going to be? Well, let's see, if we're talking about molecules, then you can actually have pretty high confidence in what you're talking about. So, for example, there is a statistical possibility that all the oxygen molecules in the room that I'm sitting in right now could all just shoot up to the far right corner of the room. And I would be left gasping for breath. There is a probability. It's a non-zero probability. It's very small, but it's non-zero. In fact, it's never been observed, and so I'm not worried. I don't have an oxygen tank handy. I don't make allowances for that possibility. So, in some respects, these patterns in history are like those patterns of the quantum theorists, in that, I can't say exactly what this person is going to do at this particular time, but if you look at lots of people over time, then there are certain things that emerge. And I'll be talking about this over the course of the semester. One I'll put out there right now. And it's something that political scientists call the theory of the democratic peace. And it's an observation that democracies, countries where ordinary people make the decisions about politics, including war and peace, democracies are less likely to go to war than monarchies or autocracies or empires. Now, one can spin out a scenario, a reason why this is true. It's observable. It's not ironclad. Some of it has to do with the fact that until fairly recent history, there weren't that many democracies around. So they weren't likely to butt up against each other in a way that might provoke one or the other to go to war. But it's observable, and you can sort of imagine why this would be true, and it comes down to the basic thing that in, let's say, a dictatorship, when the dictator says, we're going to go to war, the dictator does not mean we, as in us and me, are going to go to war. What the dictator means is you all are going to go to war. So the people at the top of the system, if they're unconnected to the mass of the people, they can say to the mass of the people, you guys go to war. And if you don't, we'll put you up before a firing squad, and that's more dangerous to you than just going to war. So in those cases where the government is responsible to the people in democracies, then the people, the ones who are actually going to have to fight the wars, they spend more time trying to figure out ways other than war to resolve their issues. So this is one of those patterns. Another pattern, and I'll be talking about this, in fact, this is the subject of a subsequent Brands law of history, that rich countries tend to have more ambitious foreign policies than poor countries. So poor countries, the United States was a poor country in 1790, and the foreign policy of the United States in 1790 was very modest. The United States did not try to tell the countries of Europe how they should manage their affairs. The United States in 1790 paid no attention to what's now called the Middle East. The United States in 1790 barely knew that Japan existed. So, the United States in 1790 was a poor country. It had few resources to commit to extending America's reach beyond just their part of North America. By the 21st century, where we are now, almost nothing happens in the world that doesn't show up on the radar of American intelligence agencies and come to the attention of the State Department, the Defense Department. So, and we're at a moment when we as a country are trying to decide whether we want to maintain this kind of eternal vigilance over all the world, something that has been an aspect of American foreign policy since basically World War II. So maybe we're going to start to back off. And some of that might have to do with the fact that relative to other countries, the United States isn't as much wealthier as it was back in 1945. But anyway, so this is one of these patterns. So the patterns, again, they don't predict exactly what's going to happen in this particular instance, but over time, you can see this. And as it relates to the current moment, plenty of people, political scientists, diplomats, and so on, are predicting that where there was a Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union in the 20th century, the contest, the challenge is going to be between the United States and China in the 21st century. And a lot of this is based on an implicit recognition of the principle of my law of history that says that, again, more on this later, that says that rich countries develop ambitious foreign policies. China is getting richer, and therefore China is willing and able to project its power abroad. Anyway, so more on that subject. But to reiterate, there are no laws of history, there are patterns. And one last thing is we historians, we spend all of our time trying to explain how we got to where we are today. We're often asked, so where are we going to be tomorrow? And we spend so much time sort of explaining how we got here, this is what we're wired to do. And so one of my stock answers when people ask me, so where is America going to be 5 years or 10 years from now? So, I mean, it gets as simple as this. I can't tell you what's going to happen tomorrow. But as a historian, the day after tomorrow, I will tell you why, whatever that outcome was tomorrow, why that outcome was inevitable. This is what we do. All for today.